Welcome to ICE Webinars, a cool place for hot topics. ICE Magazine is proud to bring our monthly webinar series to the imaging industry. ICE is the community that directly links nearly 7,000 imaging professionals with a monthly magazine, online community, annual conference, and now a monthly webinar series. We'd like to invite you to ICE 2021. The Imaging Conference and Expo is the only conference dedicated to imaging directors, radiology administrators, and imaging engineers from hospital imaging departments, freestanding imaging centers, and group practices. ICE offers valuable CE credits from the ASRT and ACI, and keeping in line with our successful conferences in the past, offers comprehensive educational opportunities for attendees. Please visit attendice.com for more details. We are excited about today's presentation featuring Carol Davis-Smith, President of Carol Davis-Smith & Associates and Vice Chair of Clinical Engineering for the AAMI Board of Directors. Today's webinar is eligible for one ARRT Category A Continuing Education Credit by AHRA and is approved for one CRA credit. You can obtain your continuing education certificate by completing the post-webinar survey after the webinar. More details on this at the end. As I mentioned earlier, our presenter today is Carol Davis-Smith. Today, Carol will move beyond the technical service assessment and focus on the clinical and business assessments important to optimal strategic technology plans. We will review the entire process and the supporting resources to ensure how all perspectives work together. Carol, you may begin whenever you are ready.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to ICE for allowing me the opportunity to engage here with this group. Just a little bit more about me so you have a frame of reference. I have been in the healthcare industry for a little over 30 years, working in frontline clinical engineering roles all the way through most recently executive roles. So I have built upon the things we're going to talk about today literally for decades, and I'm thrilled about the tools and the capabilities, the information and such that we have today to actually bring to life a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So with no further ado, let's get into this. One of the first things I am asked by people is, why should I even care about strategic technology planning? Why should I take time out of my day, just as you have done for me today? And my response really comes down to three things that I have found important throughout the course of my career, which is I dug into this topic because I wanted to be able to influence how my organizations prioritize the very limited capital spend that we had available to us. And I wanted to influence it in such a way that it positively supported, that it moved forward our organization's mission and vision. It wasn't just about buying the next cool, shiny object. And as an engineer, I love shiny objects just like the next person. But at the same time, recognizing that I needed to be a financial steward of our resources, it's really important that we have a voice and have what we need to influence that prioritization for really good decisions. Now, that voice is about communicating, right? This gave me a way, a topic and a language that allows me to talk between departments and also with enterprise executives who both influence the prioritization and also the decision makers. So I have a way of communicating with them to and influence the outcome by providing data and a structure and a framework that resonates with them. And then finally, it has routinely provided me with a way to align the resources that I'm responsible for, or that I have the ability to, again, influence or control, whether that's staff or time or budget, maybe just me as an individual contributor, maybe my team as a manager or an executive in an organization. But really the why should I care really comes down for me to these three things and behaviors and actions that I can take in my organization. So then the follow-up question is, okay, well, what is it? What is strategic technology planning? It is often referred to as capital planning, or it's also sometimes called replacement planning. It is frequently seen as a list of stuff to buy, whether that's this year or in the coming fiscal year. I, however, over the last many years, and again, literally decades, have really come to realize that it's something much bigger than that. It truly is strategic. Strategic tech planning really is one of many ongoing strategic processes inside our healthcare delivery organizations. And on this slide, I call out 4 that I think are particularly connected to the strategic technology planning process. I think a no-brainer is strategic sourcing, because once you have a plan, you have to acquire it, right? So what are all of the strategic activities that happen in the acquisition process, in the strategic sourcing processes to act upon the tech plan? Things like the value analysis committee within that influence the other direction, right? So strategic technology planning not only influences these 3, but they influence your tech plan as you go cycle to cycle, as you repeat the process year after year. Financial planning is another, well, of course, because it's how much resources do we actually have to spend, back to that prioritizing concept of very limited capital dollars. And we know today, even more painfully than perhaps in years past, how limited those resources really are. And then one process that a lot of folks sort of don't think about or doesn't come immediately to mind is really the facilities master plan. This is the built environment that our medical devices habitate, right? Where they're placed, where they're installed and operated and whatnot. So it's important to have, and we'll talk a lot more about this downstream a bit, but it's important to keep that in mind as well, as what is the built environment and where are these assets going to live and operate and drive value in our organization. The other thing that I've come to believe is a critical component of strategic technology planning is that it is not singularly, it doesn't have a single perspective. A lot of healthcare organizations that I have worked for or with over the last many years have taken either, have usually taken one of these perspectives, technical, clinical, or business or financial perspective as their primary. And if they happen to stumble into the other areas, then fine. But for those organizations that truly make optimized decisions, that truly dig in and do the hard work, they find that sweet spot in the middle where they bring all of these perspectives together. And we're going to talk about this. This is really going to be key to our ongoing conversation today through this webinar. So keep this sort of visual in mind, if you will. So to do a strategic technology plan, there's scoring, right? And again, back to where many of you on the call maybe, as I say, my personal experience with a lot of health systems is there's a lot of focus on technically determining if something should be replaced. And there's good reason for that, right? We have things like end of manufacture and end of service, those sorts of criteria when the manufacturer can no longer support us. We may be looking at third-party options in those spaces. More recently, the operating system, is it obsolete? Is it cyber safe, if you will? And what kind of maintenance history do we have on this? Those are all very familiar, probably criteria that the health systems use to decide if something should be replaced. Today, I want us to look at these other 2 areas of that multidisciplinary perspective I just described, so that we can approach or begin approaching that sweet spot in the middle where we truly optimize the decisioning. So we'll dig into each of these, the clinical and the financial, as we go through the rest of this, this webinar. So let's start with the clinical, because I believe probably most of you on the webinar are probably responsible for managing the operations of an imaging department, whether that's in a hospital or in a standalone center or some combination thereof. And so as I have interacted and learned from many of you over the years, working with imaging directors throughout the course of my career, as well as other clinical leaders, these are the 4 areas that come immediately to mind, and areas that I see high-performing progressive organizations really spending time looking at as they create their clinical scoring tools or the criteria for determining if an asset should be replaced. Or even these can also be applied to new technologies, introducing new technologies into your organization. So clinical protocols for my engineering colleagues is somewhat of a new concept. It's a new idea. They're not super familiar with this. But I know you as imaging directors are painfully familiar with this, and your radiology imaging clinician colleagues are very familiar with this. And as the feedback I get is that this is a place that you have to spend a lot of time managing and sort of corralling the troops, if you will, to make sure that you have protocols and that they're followed. So this is a first, for me anyway, this is a first stop. Let's start there and understand if a particular technology has a protocol, a clinical protocol attached to it, and are we using it? And so some of that data around, do we have the protocol and is it used, can influence the other pieces of this scoring, if you will. So in particular, regulatory impact. Some technologies, and in particular to the imaging space, have regulations and mandates about how they're used and how they are maintained or how they are calibrated or set up. And those tie normally to your clinical protocols, right? Some of these things that I'm thinking of are like in mammography, and also a lot of conversation around limiting the amount of exposure that patients get, pediatric all the way through adults. These tie directly to our clinical protocol. So understanding if there is a regulatory guideline or mandate that you need to incorporate needs to be part of your scoring, if you will, of the clinical asset. And then, of course, sort of the holy grail, utilization and your workflow, which sort of work hand in hand. You can measure your utilization. In the imaging space, you guys are probably some of the best at these measurements, because of a lot of the operational aspects of your job are tied back to this utilization data. And so that's actually really critical information to understand. Are you pushing a device, or is it sort of coasting, or does it have a lot of space that it could, a lot of time that it could be added into? And then finally, fourth, the technology backups and redundancy. This is, what do you do as an imaging director when your asset's down? Do you have another one in the imaging suite? Do you have another one in another part of the building? Do you have another one down the street? Or are you in a place where when your asset is down, that causes you to have to divert patients, or heaven forbid, send them to your competitor, right? What happens? Do you have appropriate backup and redundancy for a device if it is down, even for scheduled service, right? What do you do? So these are the key scoring criteria that I encourage health systems to go through and look at for the clinical perspective. If we shift just a minute, you'll see the financial ones have a little bit of overlap as well, in that we have the revenue line on the far right there is this kind of goes back to redundancy and utilization. Does this asset generate revenue for me? And in your space, in the imaging space, that's a highly probable, it's probably yes. But there are some imaging modalities or some applications of them where they're, if you will, part of the expense trend. And so we're looking for cost avoidance, or perhaps how they're used. Back to the utilization question, do we use them in a way that reduces or allows us to avoid costs in other parts of the hospital? This is kind of how your finance, your CFO guy or gal may be thinking. The other three are probably pretty familiar to you. Residual value, does it have any value in the marketplace at this point? Can I trade it in? Can I resell it? What are my options in that case if I decide I'm going to no longer hold on to this asset? And then the two real almost table stake sort of financial criteria that health systems look at all the time is certainly depreciation. We do not like to remove assets before they're depreciated. And so it's really important to keep track of that. And that's what your finance colleagues are there for. And then the cost of service ratio, which is sometimes lumped into the technical assessment, but it's really a financial asset, which is one measure that gives us a handle on what does it cost me to own this. And this one kind of gets overthought a lot. We all do this every day in our personal lives. When you think about the vehicle that you drive or ride, if you're a motorcyclist, what does it cost me to operate this vehicle, right? How often am I having to do repairs or put new tires or change the oil or whatever it might be, gas in the tank or electricity in the battery if you're driving the electric vehicle. It's like, what does it cost me to keep this thing running compared to what it cost me to buy it or to buy a new one, right? So it's really, it's the combination of all of these pieces then that brings us to a really robust, find the sweet spot sort of scoring tool as we look at our strategic tech plan. So we're no longer focused just on any one of these perspectives, but the combination of the three. Now, don't worry, this is an eye chart. When you get the slides, you'll be able to expand these and read the details. But let's expand a little bit on just the clinical one at this point to give you a sense now of those are the categories, but how do I actually measure these? How do I actually do this? So clinical protocol is really just yes or no. And I'll share with you that over the years, I have moved from a scale. Now, clinical protocol really is a question, and many of these are a question about, is it yes or no? So you could be very yes or no, 1 and 0, binary about the answer. But I've moved away from scales of like, even on the backups where somebody will say, do you have a backup? And it's a scale from 1 to 5, and it's close, not close, kind of close, really far away. And that puts you into a domain of very subjective and not super helpful granularity, if you will, at this point in the process. You either do or you don't have something. You either cross a threshold like utilization, a 10% change over time, or you do not. And then later you can dig into the details, the granularity of that to determine if that is important. But to get the initial scoring, to really get you into the ballpark, I am recommending now really to be as yes, no, 1s and 0s as you can be, so that you, again, remove as much opinion and subjectiveness as possible early. There's plenty of time to add opinion and politics and splitting of hairs down the road. But at this point, trying to keep it as objective as possible is my recommendation. So that sort of is a great jumping off, because then people are like, wow, okay, that's a lot of scoring, it's a lot of data. Are there leading practices? How should I sort of prioritize my time, right, as I take this on? So there are absolutely some great leading practices out there that progressive organizations and high functioning organizations are leveraging. The first and foremost goes back to my early comments. They have a plan, not a wish list, right? They have used this sort of scoring to one degree or another to create a plan, and they've documented, they've created policy to have a plan, not wish lists. They've created a process that describes who needs to be involved and what the timing is. Some folks do this for a short period, maybe just a year as they're learning to do it. Some have a policy that says this has to be in place for 5 and some even 10 years, although I find outside of 5 years is kind of hard to do with technology, medical device technology anyway. And then they put procedure in place so everybody knows what their job is, right? And they can come, it's kind of like a baseball team, right? Everybody knows their position on the field. And they know what they have to bring to the game to play their position well. This is huge, and this is fundamental to being effective in terms of having a strategic technology plan. And where I recommend everybody start is right here. No more lists, create a plan and structure it. Right on the heels of that is understanding 2 processes that I described at the beginning, which is your strategic sourcing and your annual capital planning, the time of year when everybody puts in the request that I want this new widget, right? Versus the process that is also ongoing around construction and renovation, that facilities master planning process. I've seen countless organizations that intermingle their medical device wish lists between these 2. Sometimes it's a strategy for organizations that don't have good policy and process. It's a strategy, right? I'm going to apply to both of these so I get it, hopefully, right? But the high performance organizations that are really moving this tech planning forward understand that they look at the plan and then they look at it relative to what's happening in my built environment, my facility plan, what part of this plan should be funded and executed as part of a construction project, and what part should be executed and acquired as part of an annual capital planning for medical devices. That's a lot of work, but it means there's not double dipping. It means that each of those areas really understand what their financial budget is and what resources they have available to them. So this is not a perfect science, so this gets messy sometimes, but this is fundamental to really being able to have an effective plan. The other big piece, and I guess it's sounding like there's a lot of big pieces because there are, is understanding the difference between influencers, decision makers, and understanding the funding process in your organization. And this is a leading practice that requires a skill set of sort of investigation, really understanding the DNA of your organization. If you're a single hospital, then influencers and decision makers may be the same person. If you're in a multi-hospital, multi-state, national sort of health system, then you probably have influencers at the hospital level and decision makers at the most senior level, and people wearing multiple hats, where perhaps somebody in a hospital is a decision maker in the hospital, but they participate on a committee at the health system level that allows them to make decisions about who our standard vendor might be or what our standard configuration of a CT might be, right? So some people wear multiple hats, some people wear single hats, but it's important for you to know enough about your organization's DNA to differentiate who is playing what role at what point in the process. Similarly, you need to understand how monies are allocated in your organization. I learned this lesson the really hard way. As I was managing a plan, and I was told, that's this particular item, that's good, it's approved. So my team and I, we went out to start implementing, only to find out that monies were not going to be allocated for 9 months. Needless to say, we had a lot of rework that had to be done because of timing. So understanding, in some organizations, when you get approval for a project, you also get handed the money. In many organizations, there's a lag. There may even be a whole nother process that you have to go through to actually get the funds released to you, allocated to you. Again, back to understand what's the DNA, what's the organizational structure of your particular health system so that you can plan accordingly. And that may influence the prioritization, again, back to thinking about the financial factors and criteria that you use. That process of approval and allocation may factor into that as well. Then just high level over all of this is be proactive. Get out in front of this. Again, this is looking out. This is forecasting 3 to 5 years out. It's using that crystal ball, if you will, to the best of your ability. It is allowing you to make and incorporate into some things like the contracting process, where you can begin to accelerate your short list of suppliers. Don't spend a lot of time. Be proactive. If people can't meet this, move on, right? So you don't end up in sort of a spin cycle. And the way you do that best is having that cross-functional planning. It's back to all those perspectives in your clinical, your technical, and your business or financial perspectives at the table, working this together. And none of this is any more relevant or painful than when we're starting to talk about today's products that are networked or the connected environment and cybersecurity. You have to be proactive. You have to have an integrated cross-functional team if you're going to be successful. And you have to figure out what those key pieces are to put back into those 3 scoring elements. What are the networking and cybersecurity related scoring you need in technical and the clinical environment, as well as the financial environment, but in particular, the technical and the clinical. Make sure that's integrated into your scoring. So I spent a lot of time prior to 2020 emphasizing the networking and cybersecurity, because that was really those were the things that were hitting us sort of square between the eyes quite a bit in health systems, as we were dealing with all the ransomware and the trying to prevent breaches and whatnot. And then 2020 happened, and it made all of us stop. You know, you guys know that way better than I do. But as I talked with my colleagues and watched what was happening and read the articles, there's a few sort of in the age of pandemics learnings that I think are very applicable to tech planning. Back to clinical protocols, it became very clear to me that we collectively had sort of lost track of what our clinical protocols are and what tools we need associated with them. Not everyone. I mean, obviously we've made it this far because there was enough people that were really on top of it. But I spend a lot of time talking to my engineering and technical colleagues, both in clinical engineering and IT, about we need to understand what your clinical protocols are so we can make sure that we provide you with the tools you need and that we have them in the ready. We need you to talk to us and make sure you teach us what those clinical protocols are. And if you don't have them in your organization, we all need you to look at that and define them so that we can work more collaboratively together. And not just in the hospital, but again, the pandemic has shown us we need to understand what these protocols are. It's standalone centers out in the long-term care facility and that broader continuum of care. What do we do when we need to surge? And certainly we've seen that, and we continue to see that in areas with the pandemic. But I just recently have conversations with folks on the coast that deal with hurricanes every single year. Like, how do you deal with surge? How do you deal with having to deliver care in a different place? And as we've seen with telehealth, it's in non-clinical environments now. It's in people's homes, it's in convention centers, it's in hotels. We really need to put some more thought to this in terms of where our technology is going to have to function. It's not just going to be, we can no longer think about just the acute care center that we have for so long. And then the other things that we've learned lessons are around the acquiring and the supply chains that are necessary. The consumables, parts, and services for all these devices became very difficult. So we need to factor that into our planning when we talk about replacing a major piece of equipment or even a fleet of minor equipment. What goes with it? Well, consumables usually go with it. Parts go with it, and some kind of service, whether that's in-house or external or some combination. We need to have a plan. That needs to be part of our strategy as we develop replacement and retention. Because quite honestly, a lot of this, the table has really turned, where strategic tech planning was, what should I buy up until 2020? Now it's a lot more of, what can I hold on to? What can I reallocate? I know I have to buy some things, but what can I hold on to, reallocate, reuse? Can I rent something because I only need it for a little short period of time? Can I lease something until I get my finances in a different sort of place? Can I borrow? Can I barter? I literally heard about organizations during the pandemic that were bartering. I'll trade you this for some of those. And yeah, it was out of desperation and whatnot, but are there lessons to be learned? Are there things that we can apply moving forward that will make us more agile and make us more financially sound going into the future? So that brings us back to that sort of the composite, all of these scoring areas. The red there, I want to say, in the first slide, I just had depreciation and cost of service ratio, because those are really the go-to financial scores. 2020 said we really have to look at what are the revenue generators and what are the expense generators, right? And how do we differentiate between them? We have to move forward. We have to build this into our scoring and our planning of technology in our organizations going forward. It's no longer just an afterthought. We really have to be thoughtful about, does this asset bring revenue, or does it help me reduce my expenses somewhere else in the health system? So that is an awful lot of information and a lot of different pieces. So I'm sure some of you, and certainly the question I get after kind of elaborating on that is, well, what do I do now? What are my next steps? And they're really not terribly complicated. Two keywords: engage and collaborate. Those will take your tech plan miles, if you will, because it's back to creating a team with the diverse and comprehensive perspectives of the clinical environment, the technical environment, and your financial running your business type environment, right? First, easy, very tactical couple of steps you can take is go connect up with your clinical engineering, HTM, healthcare technology management, biomed, whatever you call them in your organization. Make sure that you have documented someplace the OEM system ID number. Now this seems obvious, but I can tell you, having looked at hundreds of thousands of line items of inventory in the course of my career, this piece of data is missing frequently, and it slows the process down, because then you have to do lots of manual phone conversations and email exchanges with the OEM and try to get that number so that you can then find out where is this relative to manufacturing, service and support, clinical protocol. A whole host of questions come off of knowing what that system ID number is as it relates to its manufacturer, its original equipment manufacturer. So take the time to work with your biomed clinical engineering team to make sure that data is captured in someplace, ideally in their maintenance management system. Maybe it's in part of your records. Just make sure it's someplace. And then that takes us quickly to make sure all these different information systems are aligned. The other things that I see oftentimes is this whole idea of people like, well, we have an asset management system. You know, actually you have many of them. You have asset management systems that are focused on the maintenance, which is often your biomed team will talk about their CMMS, right? And there's financial asset management systems that are typically managed in finance, accounting, whatnot, that are tracking things like the depreciation schedule and tax burdens and things like that. You need to have these aligned. Do you have a way of connecting them to each other? Because the way they're inventoried is often very different. I have seen organizations, to sort of take an extreme example, where an entire cath lab room is one asset to the finance department, whereas the service department, your service provider, your clinical engineering biomed department, sees potentially 20 or 30 things in there between the imaging system and the table and all of the biomed sort of devices, the blood pressures and the patient monitors and whatnot that might be in there. And even the imaging system may not be one, it might be 5 or 6 assets from the maintenance perspective. Is there a way to connect that financial world single asset with the 20 or 30 in the CMMS world to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing? And so figuring out how to do that is important. Again, probably lots of ways that are easier to do it and harder to do it, but the important thing is to find a way to do it. I spent a lot of time talking about the workflows and the protocols. If you don't have them, please look at them and consider them and then communicate them, not just to your staff, certainly to your staff, but to your maintenance partner, your biomed clinical engineering department, and to your finance partners to make sure we're, again, all on the same page. This is back to that engaging and collaborating. And then when you look at new technologies, this has actually been probably some of the most fun I've had in my career, is monitoring new technologies in collaboration with my clinician partner, right? Going to RSNA or other imaging sort of conference with my imaging partners to see what's important to them clinically, and for me to be able to share what's important or what may detract from their clinical importance from a technical perspective. And sort of cutting through together, we can sort of cut through a lot of the marketing and spin that's out there and really find those new technologies that are going to drive huge value in our organizations. And then, can't say it enough, make sure you're talking to your colleagues in facilities management, design and construction, understand what the master plan is before it's time for you to just plan your piece of the puzzle. Make sure you have sort of a sense of what their vision is. You can always go ask them for details as you're building out the plan and whatnot, but make sure you're engaged so you have a general sense of what your organization is thinking relative to its built environment. So probably the last big question I get from folks is, all right, where do I get all this stuff? What are my resources? And this is a summary, again, eye chart, don't worry about it. When you get the slides, you can expand these out. But the top row are really the internal things that we've been talking about, things that are inside your organization, the CMMS and your healthcare technology management or biomed clinical engineering group, your facilities master plan, your supply chain standards and the ERP, as well as your finances. All that's inside. That's about building relationships and engaging with your work colleagues, right? And asking them questions and sharing what you have back with them. The bottom row are the external resources. Group purchasing organizations. They have, in addition to their contracting activities, most of them have a consulting arm, large or small. In both of those groups, contracting and consulting, they have subject matter experts that probably have data that would be valuable to your plan. They probably have data that would be valuable to your day-to-day operations. Reach in, grab those resources, find out who owns that relationship with your GPO, because you belong to at least one, if not 2 or 3. Find out who owns those relationships, oftentimes in supply chain, and engage with those, grab those resources and use them. Same as your professional organizations, like this webinar right here and so many others. There are lots and lots of professional organizations that, again, have data, have subject matter experts, have publications. I'm showing you one here in tiny print. It's an acquisition guide that I actually wrote to look at the process from the equipment perspective. Supply chain talks about it a lot from the supply perspective, and it's very, very similar, but there are some really important differences in terms of how you take the plan and then implement it. When you get the deck, if you want to click on that little image, I'll hover over it here, and I don't know, there, it'll show you. You have a link to get that document if you're interested. But again, all of these organizations are going to have similar sort of publications that you can get your hands on and really, again, add value to your plan. Medical device industry, of course, go to your equipment manufacturers, go to your parts suppliers, your remanufacturers, technical training places. All of these have data and subject matter experts that can provide you or point you to additional resources. And then the last group here, I kind of lump it under advisory and research service type organizations. You may be familiar with some of these. Again, oftentimes they require a subscription, but I would bet that your organization already has a subscription to at least one, if not all of these. And so it's key to figuring out who holds that subscription and request, let me have access. Let me be able to get in there and dig for what might be valuable to me. So with that, I'm going to stop. Remind you that you can submit questions if you have not already. And Jennifer, I'm going to turn it back to you so we can jump into some Q&A here.
Thank you so much, Carol, for a great presentation. We do have a few questions that have come in, but as a reminder to our audience, if you have any questions, please use the questions feature on your GoToWebinar dashboard to send in any questions for Carol today. Our first question, Carol, is how can the strategic tech plan be used to support construction projects?
Super. Good question. Tactically, so very practically, I think it starts with having a relationship with your facilities management team. And this is not necessarily the maintenance, but the folks that are strategically responsible for building out the environment. And asking for the plan, and then sharing with them that you have a strategic technology plan, and sharing data. You know, that's where it starts. Like, what are your projects? And here are my technology needs in general, or when you're ready to work on my part, I have a list. So don't worry about trying to create a list. And I can help you get in, I can help you create a baseline budget for the medical devices, or at least the imaging devices that would be involved in your project. So you start building that conversation and that engagement and that collaboration. When you're actually in the projects, there are individuals, there's professionals that come from a lot of different walks of life in healthcare called equipment planners, and you rarely get to see them. They're pushed way back in a corner, but they're incredibly important to the whole construction project because they are the keeper of the medical device list. Everything from, you know, big iron down to literally kick buckets and trays in the ORs and whatnot. And having the opportunity to meet with them and make sure they know that you have a strategic plan, then that prevents this whole them making assumptions and creating a plan of stuff that is not relevant to your game plan. So that's where those are probably the big places to plug in.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question is, my health system does not have a strategic technology plan. How can I introduce the idea?
Yeah, that's a good one, and it's a tough one. Although I will say, as I said at the top of the hour, I have spent a lot of time talking to my colleagues on the technical side and helping them see a bigger picture. I would say go to the basement or wherever they live and engage and partner up and say, let's at least begin a dialogue about how we're going to plan for imaging equipment, whether the biomed clinical engineering group services your gear or not. I would partner there. The other partner that you could approach at the same time or before or after is supply chain, because supply chain typically manages the acquisition process. And so introducing it within the value analysis framework, if you have that, or to your capital contracting person, those are places you can begin. And it's about having a conversation and saying, how do we plan instead of having wish lists? How do we move this to a more strategic perspective on behalf of our organization?
Okay. Next is, I'm not sure how to get all the data for scoring. Is it necessary to use all of the criteria?
Easy answer is no, because you'll never have all of the data. I have yet to see an organization that collected all of the data, right? And they certainly, and those that are getting close have developed that over time. So look at these recommendations for scoring criteria, and then look at what do you have easily accessible to you. I think it is more important to get started with a subset of data than to wait until you think you have it all, because that's decades down the road. I have worked with organizations that started in the clinical space, and in particular, it was typically radiology, occasionally the lab, because you're sort of a unified group, right? And so you've developed at least some beginnings of a clinical scoring. And I have worked with organizations that were starting on the technical side, building it from into manufacturer. The key is to get started, see what you have available, readily available, start with that, and get used to the process, right? Get used to building this sort of a tool. Find someone in your organization that is good at this, find someone external to your organization that's good at this, but get started, and then grow it. Let it mature as your organization becomes comfortable and more capable and has access to more and better data.
Thank you so much, Carol, for a great presentation. As a reminder to our audience, you can obtain your continuing education certificate by completing today's post-webinar survey. The survey will be emailed 1 hour after the completion of today's webinar. You must complete the survey to receive your 1 continuing education credit, and you will be able to download the certificate directly from your computer once the survey is submitted. If you have any questions, you can reach us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. ICE Magazine is proud to bring our monthly webinar series to the imaging industry. For more information about our upcoming ICE webinars, please visit icewebinars.live. Thank you all and have a great day.